Hey, what's up? My name's Casper, and today I want to talk about the labeling of mental illnesses and disorders. And I'll preface this by saying that I'm going to be making a lot of generalizations, and some of the things I say might not apply to you, and they might not apply to a lot of the people around you. So just assume I said some people if a statement sounds like I truly mean everyone. The reason I'm not saying that preface before every single time I say like, oh yeah, people this, people that, is just for the flow of speech. So this topic started because I was talking to one of my friends who's autistic, and I asked him, "What's the difference between stimming and fidgeting?" And he said that there really wasn't a difference in the action itself. The basis on which label is applied is just dependent on whether the person has autism. A neurotypical person fidgets, and an autistic person stims. So the way we view fidgeting versus stimming is pretty different. So stimming is seen as a necessity for the brain, but fidgeting has a lot more negative of connotations. Just think about what comes to mind if you compare the phrases "sorry about the tapping during class," "she has autism and stims," versus "sorry if I drum my fingers during class, I'm a really fidgety person." It's ultimately the same thing. The action and effect are the same thing. Neither is a choice, but we still respond differently, or at least hold a different implication for each, whether you actually act on that implication or not. You'll likely be more sympathetic to the label of stimming, and that sympathy won't just extend to the person, it'll extend more specifically to the action itself, which I think is pretty weird because, as established, it's the same thing. So here's another case of how labeling will affect our outlook on someone. So here I'm going to describe a person to you. They're lethargic, apathetic, constantly pessimistic, and unmotivated. The image in your mind creates, they're kind of a dick, right? But if I instead give all those labels, blah, 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 but then I say that person is that way because they have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Aw, fuck, now you gotta be sympathetic. Now you're the dick in this situation. So the person that I just described is a lot easier to empathize with, or at least sympathize with. It's not in their control. They have a mental disorder, and if they're fighting that disorder, then, we should support them. Now, major depressive disorder needs a lot more working components in your life to be fucked up in order to get that diagnosis, which means that the first person I described might very well not have that diagnosis, and so the situation is handled with less sympathy and care, while the person who does have the diagnosis gets more empathy. Just within those traits, compared to those traits, will react to specifically those traits differently, and those traits get brushed off as being outside their control. But come on, is the first person really fucking choosing to be that way? No, god damn it, of course not. They're not choosing to be that way. Not any more than the second person is, unless you're gonna say, major depressive disorder is a choice. In which case, that's another issue. On a more personal level, which is part of why I've been thinking about this for so long. This has been rattling around for a couple months in the old can up here. I show a lot of the symptoms of ADHD, and I would bet my whole college savings that I have it, but I haven't gone in for a diagnosis, and I haven't been pushing for it recently because ultimately that won't change things. I wouldn't want to be medicated for it, so I'd just be getting the label. As is, I am technically not ADHD, and there's I'll give it like a 1% chance that if I went in, I wouldn't get diagnosed. I think that's interesting because if I did go in and I talk with a psychiatrist and I go to the examination, test for ADHD comes back negative, the ADHD symptoms in my life are the same. Those don't change. I as a person in no way change. It's just I don't have that label. Those problems that would have been perceived to be ADHD, whether or not I get the diagnosis or don't, those would be the same. I would still have the stuttering wouldn't go away. I'd still have trouble concentrating. I'd still be unable to sit still. My impulsiveness wouldn't go away. But without that diagnosis, if I didn't have that diagnosis, I'd still have more in common with ADHD people when it comes to how my brain works than most neurotypical people, regardless of diagnosis, just based on symptoms alone. Hell, even the way that we look at like neurotypical versus neurodivergent is it's honestly bullshit because it's dependent on a diagnosis. It's dependent on that, and there's just so many other ways that our brains can differ that doesn't fit into a specific diagnosis, or you just barely miss the criteria for a diagnosis. To me, while I use the words for the sake of social communication and coherency, there is no neurotypical, there is no neurodivergent. Some people are more different than others. A person labeled neurotypical should still be able to get the same accommodations for things like standardized tests if they think differently or have intrusive habits, because we shouldn't play it like things are black and white with our labels. If this little bubble is the norm for like how we're going to say that like most people's brains are, and then a lot of us will draw the line of just like, okay, so here is where like, oh, this diagnosis begins. What about all the people here? Like, they wouldn't get diagnosed, but they're still a little different. What the fuck's up with that? They just don't have that label. They wouldn't get proper accommodations for things that they deserve. It's fucked up. Look, I've talked with a psychiatrist. I have a therapist, and I have confirmed medical diagnoses and medications for said diagnoses. But those aren't definitive of how I operate. What's definitive of how I operate is the actions themselves. It doesn't matter if I have X or Y diagnosis. It matters what the effects of my brain has going on. Mental health is important. You don't need a diagnosis to identify with people that do have one, whether their diagnosis be self or professionally done. You should be able to seek help without the expectation of a label that'll change how others view you, because you as a person are deserving of a baseline compassion that we sometimes only extend to those seen as different. Thank you for listening. Take care, y'all.